Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. And I apologise for my absence on Friday, but I'll get to that in a moment. Macro thoughts. I go back to the dollar, which has been moving substantially higher. I said on the 29th of September, the point I'm making is that the dollar has just started getting going. There will be blood in the water. There is a small window if we want to be the sharks. On the 1st of September, I said it has embarked on a meaningful and broad-based rally as investors anticipate a rate hike in the US ahead of all other developed economies. And on the 25th of August, I said the dollar has been punching higher. If things tip big, the dollar might soar. So I remain with that perspective, and I think the dollar is exiting a multi-year disequilibrium and therefore has plenty further to go. Home thoughts. We had a quite wonderful time in Johannesburg with the folks from Jaguar Land Rover and RMA Kenya, and I thank Sanjeev Shah for reaching out to me, and we co-hosted it, and I got a chance to invite friends, frankly, to drive fast cars around a racetrack in Johannesburg, and we were taken care of wonderfully well, and it was such a lot of fun. I like to think it's not something that people do every day, and I don't think they do, and we had a great group of people: Martin Odewar, Kitili, Patrick Kwarko, so many, Dennis McCory, who's been at Mindspeak, two visitors from Dubai, Adrian and Paul Reith, and Kiprona, of course, who's the head of the Kenyan National Chamber of Commerce, Peter Kenneth, who is a friend and was a presidential candidate, and we had an absolutely super time. I'll put up a few photographs from that event. Some of the Jaguars at Kyalami, we drove them around the racetrack, and another photograph of a group photograph that we took of everyone, and then two more, one of a selfie with Peter and Kiprono, and finally a photograph of Martin, it turns out, took of me coming down on this automated hill descent in a Range Rover. It was a lot of fun, really was. Observations are the cost of living is very low in South Africa compared to the rest of Africa. One of the chaps, because we each had an instructor with us, one of the fellows mentioned, was complaining. I said, you've got to get out to the rest of Africa because your infrastructure is first class, which it is. And I was taken aback because GDP numbers coming out of South Africa have been so soft and weak, but yet when we went out in the evening, the place was buzzing. Moving on to political reflections, the Caliph's goons taking over large swathes of Iraq this summer with their cross-desert version of Rolling Thunder, that gleaming white Toyota promo ad. And it's a very interesting piece, basically, and it comes to the conclusion which somebody else does in Asia Times, which is that the US-led coalition's purported fight against Islamic State in Kobani is akin to a parent trying to discipline a disruptive child. No matter how harsh the punishment, it will not include killing. Islamic State is simply too useful. Coming to the currency markets, Euro 124.92 fell as low as 124.40, which is the lowest intraday level since August the 22nd, 2012. My objective for a while has been 120, but I think it's going to go way below that. Dollar index 87.08. I've been extremely bullish about the dollar index, and part of that move higher has been at the expense of the yen, which was last trading at 112.77. The dollar came within a whisker of 113 in early trading. It has climbed over 3% since the Bank of Japan stunned markets by doubling down on its already massive stimulus program. Swissy 0.9646, the pound below 160, 159.78, Aussie 0.8745, Indian rupee 61.35, South Korean won 1072.38, the Rial 247.87, Egyptian pound 715.55, and the South African rand back over 11 at 11.0530. My target for the rand is actually 12. The euro was at a fresh 2-year trough of 124.40. Dollar reached levels not seen since mid-2010 against a basket of currencies, and I'll put up the 3-month dollar index. I think we're going higher. It's exiting a multi-year disequilibrium in my view. Euro dollar 124.92 when I checked last. I'll put up a 3-month chart, but I think that too will roll over and head below 120. My piece over the weekend was that the commodity supercycle is dead in the water. The US Federal Reserve announced that the quantitative easing program QE3 ended last week. At the peak of QE3, the Fed was printing $85 billion a month, totaling to more than $1 trillion a year, which is, interestingly, about half of Africa's GDP. By rolling up QE3, the Fed is signaling that the US economy is now out of intensive care. In comparison, Japan last week, catching everyone off guard, and Europe, we're going to get there eventually, are both easing and seeking to stimulate their economies. The sharp fall in the price of crude oil is estimated to be worth $1 trillion of stimulus to the US economy and will underpin and match the withdrawn QE. Due to the more democratic nature of the falling oil price, everyone or nearly everyone buys fuel, as opposed to QE3, which tends to be more narrowly focused. The trickle-down effect is set to stimulate the US consumer. The US consumer is estimated to represent 70% of the US economy. The collapse in oil prices is placing potentially intolerable pressure on a number of countries like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. In Africa, the likes of Nigeria and Angola are also set to buckle and bend under the pressure. Policymakers, in my experience, need to react with speed, but history informs us that policymakers are typically very slow to react to trend changes. The commodity supercycle is now dead in its tracks. This is a major turning point and represents a major shift away from commodity producers towards global consumers and consumer countries. Gold and silver are now at 2010 lows and headed much lower. The unwinding of the supercycle will take gold below $1,000 an ounce. The only bright spot, in point of fact, in the commodity complex have been some of the soft commodities like coffee, because of the drought in Brazil, and cocoa, which is now giving up most of its gains, but that was on Ebola concerns. This major adjustment in the commodity market, and particularly oil, will see inflation fall sharply here in Kenya, which will give some welcome relief to the Kenyan consumer. I feel that the next move in interest rates here in Kenya will be lower in the first half of 2015, and this will underpin the economy. I'll put up a 6-month chart of gold, which is at 1170.395 last time I checked, and extended declines after sliding 2.2% on October 31st, touched 1161.35, its lowest intraday price since July 2010, and it fell 4.7% last week to cap a second straight monthly loss, and I think it's going below 1,000. Crude oil just above $80 at 80.07. My target is now 60. Oil futures dropped to $80.24 in New York after sliding below $80 during trading on October 31st. I think pre-market opening, it's going to be well down. Brent crude weakened 0.3% to $85.63. Saudi Arabia is set to announce crude export prices for next month after charging the least in almost 6 years for some November shipments to Asia. And as I said, the market is now oversupplied. And therefore, it is that oversupply overhang which is setting prices. Coming to Africa, I found a photograph on Getty Images of opposition supporters protesting at the Place de la Nation in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou. They were dispersed, according to Al Jazeera, with gunfire shot above their heads. Blaise Compaoré, who had ruled Burkina Faso for 27 years, fled last week, sought refuge with his family in Ivory Coast, and then we had this confusion where there was one military leader, then another claiming power in the interim, leading to fears that the armed forces were preparing to seize control of the People's Revolution, which Burkinabés have dubbed the Sahel African Spring. It's pretty interesting how quickly this all happened, and shows that actually long-serving leaders at times might not understand how brittle their rule is towards the end. And it shows you how we live, as per Paul Virilio, whose books I've yet to receive, but I've been reading on the internet, how speed, the escape velocity, the speed with which this all happened, is the defining characteristic in many ways. The military cracked down on the protesters, apparently, by firing into the air and breaking up a demonstration in the capital's main square, and then seizing control of state television. So a fluid situation, but an interesting development, and the question I'm seeing is a lot of assertions that can this happen elsewhere in Africa. I think it can happen where you've had a very long-serving leader who just gets overwhelmed by the speed of events. And then from the Independent, Patrick Coburn, remember the time when Libya was being held up by the American, British, French and Qatari governments as a striking example of benign and successful foreign intervention? The majority of Libyans are demonstrably worse off today than they were under Gaddafi, notwithstanding his personality cult and authoritarian rule. The slaughter is getting worse by the month and is engulfing the entire country. And that was, do you remember that piece I wrote, Gaddafi's death, what's the message? And, the message is, no one's interested in what's coming after. That does not seem to be a metric anyone is measured on. And if you look at Saddam Hussein and what came after him, you look at Libya, what came after Gaddafi, you look at Syria, what would come after Assad, you cannot help but conclude that absolute chaos is what is being sought for. Dollar versus Rand, I'll put up a 6-month chart, we're back over 11 at 11.0506, my new target is 12. The European Union is ending curbs on aid to Zimbabwe, taking another step towards normal relations with Zimbabwe from Saturday by easing restrictions on aid, paving the way for 234 million euros of new funding, the bloc said on Friday. The Egyptian pound was last trading around the 7.15 level, and you will recall how firm it has been. Egyptian stock market has pushed on, up 37.216%, back above 9,000, and within 505 points of a more than 6-year high reached on September 30. Abubakar Shekau came to spike Goodluck Jonathan's, well, it's not clear what they were, but he said, if you knew the state your daughters are in today, it might lead some of you to die from grief, he said. Don't you know we are still holding your German hostage who is always crying, he taunts? If we want, we will hack him, or slaughter him, or shoot him. You people should understand that we only obey Allah, we tread the path of the Prophet. We hope to die on this path. Our goal is the garden of eternal bliss, he says. He said Boko Haram is interested only in battle, hitting, striking and killing with the gun, which we look forward to like a tasty meal, he said. You will remember a few months ago I called him the taunter. And to taunt means to reproach in a sarcastic, insulting, or jeering manner, to mock, to provoke by taunts. I'll put up a photograph of them and you'll see what I mean. The Ghana Composite Index is up 4.84% year to date. Coming to Kenya, we had some unfortunate news over the weekend, I'm afraid. Unidentified gunmen ambushed and killed at least 8 Kenyan police officers in Turkana County in Kenya on Saturday, with another 12 officers feared dead. Kenyan television stations reported that the number of dead police officers stood at 22, and a truck they were travelling in was burned down. Then we learned suspected separatists attacked barracks, police camp on Kenya's coast. Kenyan soldiers shot dead 6 suspected members of a separatist group after they hacked an officer to death in an attack on barracks in the port city of Mombasa. And then late on Saturday, officers fought off armed men at a police station in the tourist resort of Malindi. The group of between 15 and 20 men that attacked the Mombasa barracks were dressed in black, wore red and blue ribbons around their heads and legs, and all had long beards and shaved heads. This is the port city's county commissioner, Nelson Marwa. They were carrying knives, machetes, and improvised explosive devices, he told reporters. In the wee hours of today, as it was heavily raining, a gang attempted to raid the 17 Kenya Rifles barracks in Nyali, but they were met with fierce fire. In the process, 6 of them were gunned down and several escaped with gunshots. These were guys who were out to engage in war. We are holding one suspect who was arrested. Put up a photograph of Mombasa Island to take on Boxing Day, the sunset. And this goes back, and this is obviously a sharp spike, noteworthy in its synchronization that they were able to launch 2 attacks simultaneously, and it's highly alarming for Mombasa, which has been on its knees. Coastal tourism is one of the $4 billion pillars of the economy. Expectations of a rebound now have to be pushed out even further. I spoke about what I call the insurgency tail risk on the 8th of September, when I said what is clear is that the Boko Haram insurgency in the west, Abubakar, Shekau, and Al-Shabaab here in the east have both intensified and ratcheted higher. This piece was written the 8th of September. Boko Haram militants in Nigeria have killed more than 2,000 people so far. Whereas in Kenya, 179 people have died in terrorist incidents in Kenya over the same period. But obviously that number's grown sharply given the weekend events. And I said, the insurgency tail risk remains, and how it plays out will have important consequence for ourselves and the entire Africa Rising narrative. Interesting article in Reuters about Kenya pulls in brands but growth path still rocky. Kenya, like other nations on a continent that boasts some of the fastest growth rates in the world, is racing to upgrade neglected infrastructure, improve regulations, and revise often outdated economic figures to spur investment. For Kenya's challenges, many of which are mirrored across Africa, are formidable if it wants to build on recent gains. It cannot boast the high savings that helped boost Asian economies in its efforts to attract the kind of new industry that will create jobs and boost exports have had mixed results. It needs a higher rate of savings and more investment in infrastructure to boost the country's potential, said Razia Khan. Gross national savings are just 11% of GDP, below the 26% target set in the Vision 2030 economic blueprint and the kind of levels seen in some Asian nations. Then talking about how Carrefour is one of several new investors in Kenya, become the anchor tenant of the new Two Rivers Mall due to open next year in Nairobi. There is huge demand, said James Moria, CEO of Centum Investment, the main investor in the mall. What is lacking today in Kenya and Africa generally is quality places for people to do business, he said at the building site. But while consumers may catch the attention of companies like Carrefour and Porsche, the country needs to draw manufacturing and other industries if it is to generate more jobs and help expand exports beyond commodities. Apparently, I didn't know this, textiles are a bright spot. Kenya exported garments worth $335 million in 2013, and the business already employs more than 40,000 people. That's good to hear. Other firms are struggling. Even budding clothes makers complain about expensive power supplies and poor infrastructure. Eveready said in October it was stopping production of batteries in Kenya with the loss of 99 jobs and shifting that to Egypt. It is not competitive, said the Eveready CEO, and then talking about how Kenya revised the size of its GDP. GDP per capita rose to $1,246. Growth was raised upward to 5.7%. The economy has been hurt by what turned out to be unfounded worries about the election violence in 2013, but however the asymmetric risk ratcheted so much higher. And then talking about reforms that the government has made. Having ambitious infrastructure plans and projects is a positive step because of the knock-on effects it has to overall economic development. This is Ahmed Saleh of Teneo. But the challenge will continue to be project implementation. I call it sequencing. Kenya's shilling is close to 90. It's softened up because of a very strong dollar. Nairobi all shares up 16.85% this year. NAC 20 is up 6.23% so far this year. I'll put up a photograph of the Ebola check at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. And then just finally sign off with a mention of the fact that the Naivas supermarket chain, where there was a sort of internecine fighting, the High Court has found that Mr. Kagiri, who's the eldest brother and who was blocking a potential sale to Walmart, has no stake in the retail chain, having run down all the stores he inherited from his father. This was a court case in a case in which Mr. Kagiri had objected to the sale of a 50% stake in Naivas to Massmart, claiming he was entitled to 20% of the sales proceeds as part of his inheritance. It's good to be back. It's a busy week. I appreciate the support. Thank you.